Good afternoon, everyone. This is Libby Mucciaroni, Member Engagement and Education Manager at the Organic Trade Association. I'm pleased to welcome you today to the Organic Center Presents the Biodiversity Calculator, a simple tool for tracking and managing biodiversity for NOP compliance, hosted by Dr. Jessica Shade, Director of Science Programs at the Organic Center, and presented by Dr. John Quinn, Associate Professor of Biology at Furman University. The Organic Center is a nonprofit research and education organization based out of Washington, D.C. They work to conduct and convene credible, evidence-based science on the environmental and health effects of organic food and farming and communicate the findings to the public. The Organic Center's work is supported by companies and individuals who desire a sustainable and secure food system that promotes the health of humans and the environment. A few things before we get started today. This webinar is not being recorded. In the next week, Organic Trade Association members will receive a follow-up email, including the PDF slides. For any questions or comments that you may have throughout our presentation today, please share them with us in the questions panel on the platform. Following the presentation, we will have a Q&A session where our presenters will respond to your questions as time permits. For any questions that we are unable to respond to directly today, please expect a response from our staff via email within the next week. And finally, if you happen to have any technical issues during the presentation, please notify me through the questions panel, or you can email me directly. During our presentation today, we'll talk about how the Organic Center is engaging with biodiversity, highlight the Biodiversity Calculator's value and ease of use for farmers and certifiers, help certifiers understand how the calculator can be used to monitor compliance with the Biodiversity Guidance, and encourage the farmers in attendance to engage with biodiversity tracking and conservation. Now, let me introduce you to our host for today's webinar, my colleague, Dr. Jessica Shade. Dr. Shade is the Director of Science Programs at the Organic Center, where she directs projects associated with communicating and conducting research related to organic agriculture. During her tenure, Dr. Shade has collaborated on a number of diverse research programs, ranging from applied solutions to on-farm challenges to methods for improving environmental impacts of agriculture. Some of her most recent collaborations include projects aimed at decreasing nitrogen pollution from agricultural sources, increasing on-farm biodiversity, and developing integrated pest management solutions for organic growers. She developed and leads the center's signature conference event, Organic Confluences, which brings together policymakers, researchers, farmers, industry members, and other nonprofits to address and overcome challenges related to the organic sector. Dr. Shade, thanks for joining us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Libby. And I'll just give a brief introduction about the idea behind this tool, and then I'll hand it over to Dr. Quinn. So basically, biodiversity is something that the public, researchers, et cetera, have been becoming increasingly aware about, and especially aware of the importance of biodiversity and the ecosystem services that biodiversity can provide. So things like biological control, carbon sequestration, purification of air and water, high quality soil, flood control, et cetera. And right now, the estimated global value of these ecosystem services from biodiversity exceeds $33 trillion per year. So for example, beneficial species alone, like insects and birds, provide about $4.5 billion in biological pest control and $3.1 billion in pollination services annually. And that's really important for organic farmers because they also, not only do they provide pollination, but they also reduce the need for external inputs and can lead to increased yields. So one of the great things about organic farms is that not only will it benefit from increased biodiversity and balance, but it can also be a source for biodiversity. And in 2016, the National Organic Program formalized biodiversity as a central tenet to the organic standards. It had always been central to the ideals of organic, but it was formalized in 2016 by publishing its guidance on natural resources and biodiversity conservation, which was pushed for by a lot of great groups, including the Wild Farm Alliance, which helped us with this tool. And that guidance was really a direct response to the need for supporting on-farm ecosystem services through organic agriculture. But that guidance isn't always clear for farmers or certifiers, and the responsibility of designing and implementing technical plans is really placed on the farmer or on the certifiers who are trying to understand how to track this guidance. There's also variations in farm size, farm type, geographic location, and all of that influences the feasibility and effectiveness of biodiversity-friendly farming techniques. So there isn't this one-size-fits-all conservation recommendation. So right now there's a lot of great research on identifying techniques and specific on-farm best practices that will lead to biodiversity increases in farming systems. But the translation of that information is limited, and there's also not as much understanding of on-farm implementation. So it can kind of keep a lot of the information from getting into the hands of the farmers. So one of the things that we wanted to do was provide this very simple, farmer-friendly tool for looking at biodiversity with this interactive front-end interface that includes mandates released by the National Organic Program so that farmers and certifiers can help track and increase on-farm biodiversity to comply with the guidance. So there are a lot of biodiversity tracking systems out there. A lot of them are fantastic. What this does is a little bit different because it's really helping people to understand and comply with the NOP biodiversity guidance. So this will hopefully make it easier for farmers to understand what's going on in their farm, for them to see where they're excelling, where their needs work, and allow them to track it over time so they can understand how things are changing from year to year. So with that, I am going to pass it over to Professor John Quinn. He is a professor at Furman University, where he's been since 2012. And before that, he was a postdoc at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. He has multiple awards, including the Teaching Award of Merit from North American Colleges and Teachers of Agriculture, Award for Teaching Excellence from UNL, as well as things like the Louisiana Association of Professional Biologists Best Paper Award of 2009. So, John, we're so happy to have you with us, and I'll hand it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you for the wonderful, thorough, and kind introduction. It is been one of the best parts of my career, this kind of opportunity to engage in this space of biodiversity with organic farmers. You know, in my bio, it was that said there, I was in Nebraska. I was fortunate to work with over 30 organic farmers in the state, researching practices that to improve bird diversity on those particular areas. But as part of that, grew this, this interest in how can we better assess and monitor biodiversity. And so that is what I am going to be able to share some with you today. Is the idea that there's a lot of resources out there for farmers, but ultimately, since the responsibility is on the farmer to develop their OSP, to maintain biodiversity, that some better infrastructure, better tools are needed for that. So we, in response in 2016 to the guidance for biodiversity, we recognized that some of the existing tools, while, as Jessica said, were helpful, didn't necessarily align with this organic standards. And so we wanted to deconstruct those past tools and then rebuild one that specifically was in response to the OSP guidance, or I'm sorry, the NOP guidance. Today, I want to first just start off to say, like, this is an enormous group effort. The 4 groups posted on here have, you know, this latest iteration of it, but some of these seeds of these ideas started back when I was in University of Nebraska, have met with lots of farmers, have met with lots of individuals. And so this is truly a collaborative effort that would not have come to this point without the support of these 4 entities, but also many other people who, you know, one slide couldn't fill. What I want to talk about today, though, is how to use the tool, but also why we've built the tool the way we have. Arguably, in my bio there, maybe I should, you know, I started out as a bird biologist, so interested in biodiversity broadly, in particular, how do we protect biodiversity in different ecosystems. But have kind of through my career, you know, taken up this interdisciplinary space where my research and interest lie as much now in social science as they do in the natural sciences. So part of the tool structure is biology, is the specific indicators, but I think a more important part is how the tool is actually built to guide almost structured decision making. It's not quite that formal of a process, but there's very deliberate components that went into that we'll talk about today to help choose targets, to set goals, and how that works, and then end with a little bit of almost psychology, but you know, what are antecedents of behaviors that we want farmers to see adopt. Our audience on the webinar is diverse. I know we have farmers, certifiers, inspectors, students, and researchers and extension agents. So I hope throughout that the talk here, or the webinar, that you'll all find something of interest, and hopefully by the end to see how it all comes together. Please do not hesitate to ask any questions. There is a lot that we could talk about, but I think I tried to pull out, you know, how to use the tool effectively in this context. This is just because I've been trying to think, well, let's start with the main point, right? Rather than an academic who spends 40 minutes getting to the point, let's start with the main point. This is the tool. The tool is an online interface where you go to the particular website, and it has a series of tabs across the top. The key part, you know, are the 3 different calculators here. If you are the sort of person who likes to multitask, I'm going to leave this up for a moment. If you have your phone on you, you can scan the QR code. If you are on your computer, quickly type in that website, and feel free to kind of poke around with the tool itself. I think that's the best way to get to know it, rather than, you know, having this be a how-to. This is not necessarily a how to use the tool, but why the tool works. So I'm going to give another 10 seconds if anyone's frantically typing the overly long website. We can also share this with you all in another context. Okay, the tool, if you did go through and you clicked on it, has 3 different calculators depending on, you know, what type of farm you have. And I just want you to see the structure here, and then we'll come back and work through it in a different context, where what we're looking at here is your generic cropland, or sorry, generic calculator for all the farms. There is on the left hand side a column where you could choose selected indicators. It is interactive. There are different indicators that we've chosen, we've validated based on science, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. The next part is, the data endpoint, and then you set a target, which is a key part of good conservation planning, good urban planning, and then broader planning documents. At the end, if one had gone through and used it, you can hit the report button, and it generates a report. Here there's no data in, so you can see under the scores that there is nothing to report at this time. But as a consequence of kind of working through the particular tool over a short period of time, you would have a report that's automatically generated for a particular person to use. Okay. So perhaps more interestingly though, is why is a tool like this needed? Jessica did a nice job of introducing that up front. The ultimate reason was that there was the guidance in 2016. It caught me by surprise that was well over 3 years ago, but it's been a good prompt. I know I'll reference the Wild Farm Alliance a couple of times. Joanne, I saw you were on there, so a hello from afar. Is working to support farmers in this process. One thing we did with Wild Farm Alliance is we actually went through and inventoried all the OSPs to see how they were aligning. And there was some good OSPs, suggested OSPs, and some that needed some work. And so now we're kind of helping move that process along a little bit over the last 3 years. So ultimately, why is this needed? Is it is required as part of organic farming. But I hope by the end of the talk or by the end of the webinar, you have a sense that following and maintaining biodiversity and assessing it can be part of a broader social process where engaging farmers, engaging community members, that ultimately internalizes a lot of the practices and makes it more than just ticking a box. I think one reason I have enjoyed working with farmers so much is they are key decision makers on their land, and they are representative and good models for other farmers across the US. This is a cool data set that just came out that these folks, Malek et al., mapped out the number of organic producers per 25 square kilometers at a global scale. I pulled the US data, but you can see that there are clusters of organic farmers across the US, and these are important lands that we need to manage, and in particular manage for biodiversity. I also think helping farmers, if you're a certifier, if you're an inspector, if you're a researcher, helping farmers understand the complexity of what is biodiversity. I think when you add that complexity to a system, it's easy to the complexity of it makes it, you can almost have a stalemate where you're like, I'm just going to do something simple. And so working with farmers, because they are such an important part of the landscape, is key. And so why this tool? Because we want farmers to engage in the decision-making process more rigorously than just, do you maintain biodiversity or do you benefit wildlife, yes or no? How are you doing that? How can you demonstrate your successes? One of the key parts that came in is that there are so many indicators possible. There are indicators for profit, for water quality, for social cohesion, for soil quality. Biodiversity is just one of those. And even within biodiversity, there are way too many indicators for anyone to sort through and choose for themselves. So one thing we wanted to do with the tool was filter through those and find the indicators that are best reflective of science. And this is where I personally, got the most engaged with it. Is my work I did in Nebraska was looking at what practices on organic farms increase biodiversity. And so what we did, myself and my students, was go through the literature on, focused first on organic farms, then in agricultural systems more broadly, and identified ways that, we found evidence for what are indicators that are based on the best science. And so one of the indicators that's in here is habitat heterogeneity. How diverse is the habitat on a farm? And that indicator specifically comes from some of the work we did in Nebraska and others have done in other parts of the country and world, showing that more heterogeneity on your farm increases biodiversity. So you can see the graph on the right, the bird abundance increases, which is the y-axis, as habitat diversity increases on the x-axis. So that's a big part of what we did. I have talked about that in the past, and so trying to make sure that webinars are not redundant and give value to all of you. That is, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the science behind all the indicators. I'm more than happy to engage with folks in that in another context. I think that's a really important component, is to have indicators that are based in science and reflective of the best science. But I think a component that often gets missed is our goals of a particular farm or farmer or landowner aligned with the indicators that they're interested in. And so to think about this deliberate process that as a certifier, as an inspector, as a farmer or researcher, again, anyone who is in this forum thinks, okay, I want to work with a landowner in this process. Being very deliberate about how indicators are chosen, I think goes a long way to adding value to this process and adding value to this tool. So we think of differentiating between goals, sometimes they're called objectives as well, and indicators, is we can think of a goal as more of a qualitative statement. It can arguably provide a particular individual a reason to care. It's for good or bad. As I can be a cold, rational scientist and say, values. My science is devoid of value, but we are all driven by values, and that's something we'll talk about at the end on this idea of relational values and how we connect with the land and what we choose to research. So the farmer's goals are driven by values, and so we want the indicators to connect to those goals, because ultimately, if you have something you care about, you're going to be more motivated to engage in that. The Wild Farm Alliance has a number of great resources that can kind of help with this goal setting. And I'm going to take the risk here to close PowerPoint and see if, so I think you all can see the part of the biodiversity guide from your Wild Farm Alliance. It's a great resource. I would encourage you all to take a look at it. But it specifically uses the word goal. And if you search through, you see these as broader terms. So we want to optimize water use and riparian functions. So that sets that as a goal. You could say another goal could be to increase biodiversity. Let's see if we go back. So here's another goal, just a quick search, support biodiversity in natural areas. As a goal, that is a fantastic goal. And I think setting goals is the first part of that process. The tool is not designed to help you set goals, but once those goals are set, you're able to reflect on those a little bit more. What's key about indicators is they make your goal measurable. So you want to enhance biodiversity. That is a fantastic goal, but that's a very difficult thing to measure. What aspect of biodiversity? If we think about what is biodiversity most broadly, it's a gene, species, and ecosystems. Are you going to measure pollinators? Are you going to measure birds? Are you going to measure plants? Are you going to measure invertebrates? So it can be a very complex thing just to increase biodiversity. So the indicators are set up to make those goals measurable. And in a perfect world, we kind of see then the goals and the indicators as an iterative process, where we can see our sustainability goals and objectives are set on the left, and those goals inform the indicator selection. And so Jessica said at the front, every farm is different, and this is one of the most important things I learned early on was, two farms that might be a mile apart will be different in size. One will have a riparian buffer, one will be in the uplands, and so their indicators need to reflect that. This is a good opportunity to introduce some of the different types of indicators that we'll talk about in a moment, where you have three types: natural, proxy, and constructed indicators, where our natural indicators are a direct measurement of some sort of phenomena, in this case, biodiversity. Proxy indicators, might be one step removed, where you're assuming if they might be correlated, where if habitat increases, then your bird species will breed more successfully. Constructed indicators tend to be aggregate measures. One of the past projects we did was a healthy farm index. You could call that a constructed indicator because it took multiple different measures and put it in kind of a unitless component, but tracked the change. The nice thing is, if you have indicators that clearly align with your goals, then you're able to track progress towards achieving that. So again, this gets to, rather than seeing the OSP as just something you have to do, is seeing the OSP and the biodiversity guidance as a mechanism or a reason to set goals, choose appropriate indicators, and then track your progress towards that. If we just to think about that a little bit more, and I think as you look at the different indicators in the toolkit, or in the NOP, in the different levels there is a mix of natural and proxy indicators. Some things are just harder to measure, and we'll talk in a few minutes about. We tried to make indicators or select indicators that were reasonable to measure. Going out and measuring the amount of dissolved oxygen to some very specific level that as a water chemist might be interested in might not be practical for a farmer, but maybe measuring the percent of fields that are buffered or percent of waterways are buffered as a proxy for that can be more effective. So this is the more objective and subjective could be seen as in a normative context where objective is better. But I think it's important to recognize that sometimes a good proxy indicator goes a long way towards some sort of change. So again, as you think about what indicators are ideal for your farm, or if you're a certifier that you want to encourage your farmers to adopt, thinking about this objective to subjective component and natural, proxy, and constructed indicators can go a long way towards kind of facilitating that discussion and seeing the value of the data. For those of you, I think there were a few students and researchers out there. To the best of my knowledge, no one has done an assessment of the farm assessment tools, organic or not, to see what is the ratio of natural, proxy, and constructed indicators in the literature or in the tools that have been adopted. We did something similar for urban systems, and we found that there were more natural indicators than we would have hypothesized up front. So if you're a graduate student, that might be a simple paper. Just give me credit at the end, an acknowledgement. All righty, so back to our tool here. So we've talked a little bit about the different types of indicators, how your indicators should be aligned with your goals. So if we look at what the tool is itself, and if any of you did open the website, I hope we didn't crash it. I'm going to flip back here and we'll look at the tool itself, and we can click through, and we'll start here with the calculator for all farm types. So this would be the one for most farms to start with. You might come over here and say these. So when we broke the indicators in different groups, there were different components of talking with Wild Farm Alliance on what are some ways to interact with biodiversity. So can we kind of classify these indicators into different goals? So one goal was that a farmer would take steps and plan for biodiversity. So what are some indicators that a farmer or a farm is engaging in that? On the left-hand side, we can see, or there's, are you working with different people? Is your farm mapped? These are, different proactive things that one person might do. I'm going to close my, and then protecting natural areas. here's protecting non-crop habitat, maintaining wildlife, number of birds observed is very much a natural indicator. So we have different sets of indicators for the cropland calculator, again, based on different goals, and then different indicators for the livestock calculator. I would encourage folks to explore those, think about what works well in their particular area, how appropriate is it for a particular landscape, a particular ecoregion. The other aspect that we put down here, because there's always that sense of I would like to choose something different, is there is a user selected component. The nice thing is it's for the most part dynamic, and so if we said number of crops in rotation, it fills in our little chart on the bottom. So choosing indicators based on your goals is that first part. And then let's return back here to kind of our structure. Some other, as you're thinking about indicators, you want them to be sensitive to change. And this is always that tricky space where what is best, there is no one perfect indicator. Everything is a trade-off between the amount of time and money, resources, skill, how sensitive is or not. There's classic work with macro and micro invertebrates and stream systems where those species are sensitive to environmental change in aquatic systems. In the United Kingdom, birds are an important national indicator. And I pull this one up because you can see the bottom there, the red line representing the decline of farmland birds. Again, speaking to the importance of conservation. So we've tried to choose some that are more or less sensitive. You want something that though is sensitive to change, because you don't want to choose an indicator, collect the data, and never see any progress towards your goals. It should also be practically measurable, and we've tried to make sure that our indicators are something that a farmer can measure in a realistic way. This is Liz Sarno, who is one of the great organic farmers we worked with in Nebraska, really helped me to work through some of these, like how often should an indicator need to be collected in order to be accurate. That's one of the challenges with insects, is they can be so ephemeral, so you have to sample weekly in order to capture that. Or our birds that are more on an annual basis, a better indicator, but then they might miss something more subtle. So again, there's no perfect indicator, but just some variability across those. The last step, and this is where I think it really gets into that thinking process. And this is where, as a tool, it goes past just monitoring. It really moves towards some of the planning literature or planning disciplines to give structure to what it is. So this last one is our targets. Where for that, if you've set a goal, you've chosen an indicator to track that, where do you want to be as a function of the management choices on your farm? Establishing targets is fundamental to this process. Again, every farm is going to be different. And so just saying that you should have the highest richness of birds possible for your county might not be realistic for every farm. Maybe it's a 10% increase in pollinators is what you're interested in, or a 5% decline in sediment erosion. And so when we're thinking about targets, you have to include your values as part of that, and then add the data into it. Ultimately, there are trade-offs between goals. This part of the biodiversity is only one part of your OSP, one part of the operation, and so there are if we were only focused on biodiversity, we'd have a different set of goals if you're trying to increase biodiversity in a working farm. So it is a compromise. And then ultimately, it should be something realistic to achieve. The worst case scenario is you set a target that is impossible, or it is, because then it ultimately becomes demoralizing. But it also shouldn't be too simple where you just have to, if I make this small change, then it's done. It should be somewhat aspirational, in the context. So trying to find that band, and that's where those targets are, again, a mix of values and data. It is not just pick a number out of a hat. Alrighty. When you're choosing your targets, you want to avoid ambiguous targets. Again, if we're thinking about our indicators as a trackable change towards our goal, so you want to avoid things like more biodiversity or a healthy ecosystem. Those are great terms, but they're not measurable in any way. You want to think about how it's going to be measured and how the data will be obtained. And then, again, make sure that that target is aligned with at least one of your goals. So if you're not interested, I'm a bird biologist, I get all excited about birds. If you don't care about birds, it probably doesn't make sense for you to necessarily choose that. If pollinators are what you're interested in, or plants or soil microorganisms, focus on something that you find interesting, because that's going to provide that aspiration. Because these targets ultimately are a personal goal as well as a scientific goal. So this is, has been one of the areas of development for me as a researcher, in the sense of science can be seen as clean, objective, but ultimately, when we're trying to create change, there is that personal component to it. Sometimes historical baselines can serve as a good point for your target, although I am inherently skeptical of this, because what is a historical baseline? What is natural anymore? 39% of our planet is dedicated to farming and food systems. And so what is natural is natural. I put up a picture of succession here on the left at any one given point in time. So baselines can be a good number, and I'm going to present a baseline in a little bit, but be sure to think about what that really means for your context. I do think it's valuable. On the other side of that is to avoid shifting baselines. A lovely comic here at the end, I think, summarizes it well. Those of us, if you're younger, you might have a different perception of what the environment is or what that goal is. And so sometimes looking backwards in time or talking to others, making this more of a community process can be particularly valuable. So that just your one perception, your one values or your one goals doesn't misalign what you're presenting. In a little bit, I'm going to talk about kind of the more social aspect that this could potentially provide, and I think that is one way to kind of buffer against that. Sometimes you can look to other entities for targets. Sometimes they're misaligned in scale, but can provide a good space. The Sustainable Development Goals have, sometimes they will define a good target. What I like about this is this kind of, starts to think about those targets in that broader context. I did say I do like birds. There was a great paper that came out in the last 2 weeks showing it was a 50% decline in birds across North America. And so, maybe if we've said we would, one target is an increase in grassland birds by 10% on my farm, that's going to contribute directly back to regional conservation. Especially if we look at the map here on the left, that is some of our prime farmland. Grassland birds are the species that have seen the greatest decline across all individuals. So again, if you need inspiration for choosing good targets, there's good resources out there from Audubon, from Xerces Society, from the NRCS, lots of different resources out there. I do think one component that I really would like to see expanded more is, choosing specific targets as on farms as a participatory process with multiple individuals. The farmers I worked with in East Central Nebraska were a community, and they would talk about things. And so sometimes I wonder, could some of those targets be set in kind of that collaborative decision-making process, where the stakeholders who are the farmers define what those goals are for a particular region through kind of a, setting goals, make plans, incorporate, communicate, and talk about those so that a region has that shared set of goals. Ultimately, what I like about that is it starts to build social cohesion across that process. Thresholds can be another way to choose those. If you know how much economic damage is caused by a particular outbreak or how many beneficial species you need, that might be an appropriate target. And then, so those going through there quickly. So again, lots of different ways you could choose a target. I think one thing to stress is like there's not one right way, but ultimately to think about, choosing your goals, choosing your indicators, choosing your targets is a deliberate process where you should think about it. So that's reflective of your values, your farm, and the practices that you want to implement. Okay, the last one, just because I think it's good information to include, is why, coming back to that component, we are losing biodiversity. We are losing species at an order of magnitude 2 to 3 times greater than our normal background extinction rate. So it is a serious problem, whether it's birds or insects or plants. We are losing species globally, and it's something we have to address. I've said this in every organic talk I do in this realm, is organic farms benefit biodiversity. Most studies show that there are more species, more individuals, better breeding or nesting success on organic farms and non-organic farms. There's modifiers for that, the region, the landscape it's embedded within, how the farm is managed. But if we're going to address this organic crisis, or if we're going to address the biodiversity crisis, organic farms need to be part of that. Ecosystem services that Jessica talked about, I always think those are worth mentioning. I think the values of them continue to increase, and so we're easily talking trillions of dollars. And the last estimate I heard was that natural capital ecosystem services provide more economic value than global GDP. So nature is worth more than all of our human constructs. One thing I always like to point out is soil erosion, and in particular control of soil erosion is probably the most valuable ecosystem service. And so we think about pollination, that's the kind of charismatic, for lack of a better word, ecosystem service, but erosion control, and so good erosion control on your farm is so economically important and something to kind of think about. All right, the kind of touchstone here, our last key point before I transition to the social context of this, is this kind of makes it sound like it's easy, right? If we look at this figure from John Foley on the right, it talks about that's a good set of goals. We want to balance these ecosystem services and biodiversity and crop production on our farm and optimize that. We all agree, right? I don't think there's anyone listening now who would say, no, that's not something I'm interested in. But just all of us agreeing that that's what it takes is arguably not enough. And so this is where some of the real deeper value of a consistent tool, engagement in this planning process of goals, indicators, and targets is so valuable. Because ultimately, if we see certification as a behavior and the practices that farmers are doing as behaviors, is knowledge, me giving a webinar, sufficient to create that change? From the social science world, we see here a model of antecedents of pro-environmental behavior. To simplify it, I have put the important ones in red for now. What you can see is that awareness of consequences or ascription of responsibility to the left of that there are as many steps removed from actually adopting an environmental behavior. So me telling you that you should, or that biodiversity is being lost and that we're losing birds precipitously, you're aware of that consequence, or that sediment erosion is a serious environmental problem. We're aware of it now, but there's a lot of steps in between that I think, seeing the OSP process, either for biodiversity or more broadly, can really shape these other antecedents of pro-environmental behavior. So we think of attitudes, norms, intentions, behavioral controls. And so we're going to say those do not equal, and then move forward from there. And so if we think about what this is, our current norm is that the organic farmer has an obligation to provide data in their OSP. Like, it's something I have to do. I have to do this once a year. I submit this. But what I think could be more interesting and start to see this as a more engaged practice is that investment in their farm and that investment in the data, where the behaviors that they're choosing to adopt are more than just checking those boxes, and that setting goals, choosing indicators, and choosing targets really starts to facilitate that more citizen science, co-creation of knowledge, and some of these other ideas that are, I think, much richer in behavior change. And so if we start thinking about what maybe this OSP tool can help address, is social norms, is attitudes towards biodiversity, is the perceived ability for an individual farmer to create that change that they're interested in, because that's going to modify intentions, which ultimately will modify environmental behavior. And so I had been confident to that for a number of years, just reading papers here and there. But this last year, with my wife and Dr. Courtney Quinn, Dr. Karen Allen, all three of us at Furman, we did a review of what sort of non-economic drivers motivated farmers' adoptions of sustainable farming practices. We searched for, culture. How does the culture of a particular area, or the culture of biodiversity, or the culture of sustainability influence farmers' adoptions of pro-environmental behaviors? One thing that we found was very important was this idea of social cohesion. So when a group of farmers share a similar set of goals, they're more likely to adopt those behaviors. A sense of place, individual identity. So if you are aware of your farm and collecting that data, and then ultimately a stewardship as a duty to protect the land and engagement in that. And so really seeing the calculator, which could be seen as just a simple set of numbers to put into your annual certification, actually is a tool to also engage in these broader questions of what influences adoptions of pro-environmental behaviors. And so as part of that, we pulled a couple of examples of where this idea of intrinsic value, which is, we want to do it because we want just to protect it. It's nice, a space. You can see deforestation laws or mandated riparian buffers, which we're trying to put an economic value on it, which is often what we think of with the instrumental value, where we might pay farmers for a particular practice, or programs for ecosystem services where we pay to reduce deforestation. Rather, we can see on the far right on this idea of relational value. So the relation of farmers with biodiversity, the relation of farmers with their land and with each other. You can see on the second example was a great one for China, where when extension agents were working with farmers, that social cohesion improved the adoption of practices. So really thinking of the guidance as a tool to create a more holistic view of how do we create change in environmental behaviors. The tool helps address attitudes. It helps address social norms if those goals are set together. It helps set perceived behavioral control. The farmer is setting those targets for their farm for what they want to accomplish. And I think that is a fundamental component of being more successful in this realm of monitoring biodiversity. Alrighty, so I'm coming to the end of my component here, so I'll pull this up. And so if we think about it, we want farmers to feel they have the ability to perform or reach a particular target. And so engaging in that process throughout is key. We want to shape habits, right? If monitoring your biodiversity in your farm every year becomes a habit, you're much more likely to be interested in maintaining it rather than just checking a box. And then also, do we have a social norm? We used to joke the first thing we did with this is we want farmers to talk about how many birds they had at their farm at the coffee shop in the evening. That is, changing what those goals are. And again, engaging in this process as more than just checking a box is key. Alrighty, so through all of that, I think I've presented, seeing your OSP and seeing biodiversity monitoring as part of an iterative management practice, where as a farmer, you plan, you say, here's my goals, here's what I want to do, here's how I think I'm going to get there. You do it, right? So we see on that bottom part of the arrow. And then you evaluate, did that work? Did that particular practice, did putting in buffers help pollinators, or was your fruit set rate different from one year to the next? If it worked, keep doing it. If it didn't work, then you adjust, learn and do it again. And I think the more social this process is, whether within certain certifiers or among the organic community, the more powerful this process will be. Alrighty, so with that, I think it gives you a short view of the tool as a whole. Again, there's a lot of indicators out there. I think what we have hopefully accomplished or presented to you is that we have a cohesive set of indicators that are suitable for farmers to monitor biodiversity on their farm. We have created a tool that helps farmers select those and encourages them to set appropriate or suitable goals and targets and track that. The last thing that I will do that I want to show here that actually I need to leave is, if you do all of that, you can hit report, and when it works, you can hit download report, and when it doesn't work, which I'm going to come over here, it works just as well to print, and you get a lovely little report auto-generated from that, and then you could include that in your OSP on an annual basis. The nice thing is, since it's standardized format, that will exist year after year, and you can just build up a solid set of records. Share it with your friends, share it with your collaborators, share it with your certifier, and I think it's an easier way to engage with biodiversity and monitor it on your farm. So with that, I will ask if anybody has any questions. And actually, yeah, I'll ask if anybody has any questions. And I know there's two more slides that the Organic Center wants to make sure that they show as well.
All right, Libby, do you want to go ahead and show those last two slides?
I think I have control for that. There we go.
Yeah, I can definitely talk about upcoming education while people start filling in and providing us with any questions that you have for the next 5 or 6 minutes. It looks like a few are coming through. Jessica, do you want to do Q&A first, or do you want me to do the upcoming education?
Yeah, we'll go ahead and do Q&A first. So we've already got a lot of questions coming through. One of the questions, John, is from a farmer who's wondering if there is a right set of questions, a right set of indicators for his farm. So is there a right versus wrong?
Yeah, there is not one for any given farm. There is not one right set of indicators. I think that those sets of indicators that are chosen should be reflective of science, and hopefully we've done the hard work for that. But they should also reflect the farm itself and the motivations of those particular farmers. So that's why I think the other way we could have gone with this is just given the farmers 10 indicators and said track these, but I don't think that would have engaged the individual in the process to the same extent. So I think so I would say no, there is no one right set of indicators. There is an ideal set of indicators for a given farmer that reflects their values, their farm, and their motivations to improve biodiversity.
All right, great. There is somebody who's asking for the full citation for the Allen et al. 2018 paper. So maybe we can send that out after the fact when we do a follow-up.
I can do that real quick.
Okay, great.
I can multitask.
Okay, fantastic. So one person is asking what is concretely required on biodiversity in the NOP, not just recommended. For that, I will direct you to the Biodiversity Guidance, and I will send that out as a link for people so you can look yourself at this guidance so you can see what is what the exact wording is. If there's a certifier who is on the call, you are welcome to raise your hand, which you can do. There's a little way to raise your hand here, I think, or you can type it into chat, the answer. All right, another one. So Marissa Altman is on the phone and she has a quick comment. Libby, is there any way we can unmute the line so she can make her comment?
I'm working on that. That may not be an option with our current setup, but I'll let you know in a sec.
Okay, Marissa, if we can't unmute, you can go ahead and type it into the chat and just make sure that all entire audience is selected so that everyone can see that.
I think you figured it out.
Great.
Okay, hi. So my name is Marissa Altman and I work with the Wildlife Friendly Enterprise Network. First, I want to thank you all for the great work that's gone into making this amazing resource. We will be adding it to our list of existing resources on our website, which is wildlifefriendly.org. I also wanted to say that we are a separate certification, so we aren't organic, but we certify both wildlife friendly and predator friendly in North America. We've been doing this for over a decade, and our standards are also driven by science and best practices that were actually started to be written in 1991. So again, I just wanted to mention certification, specifically wildlife friendly, as an add-on. It's a great add-on to organic. You can learn more about our certification programs and see our standards at our website, which is www.wildlifefriendly.org. And my email address is marissa@wildlifefriendly.org, and I'll go ahead and type those out so you have them.
Okay, thanks, Marissa. Another question is specifically about food safety. So a lot of third-party food safety organizations have the opposite attitude about biodiversity on farms. So this question is, how do you attract birds without having a food safety issue? And I'll go ahead and answer this one, John, and you can add in anything you want to. But this is something that I hear from organic farmers time and time again, is that there is this conflict between organic regulations that encourages biodiversity and encourages tools to increase biodiversity, things like intercropping or hedgerows, etc., and some third-party food safety certifications that come out and say, get rid of those hedgerows, stop intercropping because it's going to attract wildlife and that could defecate on your farm and create food safety issues. So unfortunately, those food safety organizations are not up to date on the most recent science. Science has been coming out recently showing that increased biodiversity does not lead to increased food safety risk. In fact, it shows the opposite. So the more diversity you have on your farm, the lower the pathogen presence is. And this is, I mean, knowing that doesn't necessarily help the farmers who are combating these unscientific regulations from food safety. But it's one of the things that we're hoping to do is really make this communication that, hey, none of these biodiversity, none of these strategies for increasing biodiversity actually impact food safety, and actually they can have the opposite effect. So that's one of the things that if you're more curious about, please email me, because I can share scientific resources that show that increased biodiversity can decrease those human pathogens on farm. John, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that same statement, that the literature is, consistently out there saying that, yeah, those are not in opposite one another. I will also say the Wild Farm Alliance has done some serious literature accumulation on that. To me, the best paper comes, is my screen still the live one? But if I can, it's co-managing fresh produce for nature conservation and food safety. Daniel Karp and colleagues did a nice bit of work on that. So that seems if anything, it makes it worse. And so that's the worst.
John, if you don't mind typing that that citation into the chat, that would be fantastic. And just make sure that you've selected all entire audience so everyone can see that.
Okay.
And we are unfortunately out of time. I'm so sorry we didn't have time to answer all these questions. We have so many questions. Feel free to follow up directly with me. I am happy to answer whatever I can. If I can't answer it, I will pass it on to John. This is a really great group. We have really thoughtful questions. Joanne is on the line, and she has a comment here about NOP requirements. So maybe before we hop off, Libby, if we can unmute Joanne Baumgartner so that she can just talk about the NOP, what it actually says about the farm operators, because I know that she's been working closely with CCOS, so she's the perfect person to answer this question.
Hi, yeah. Well, that NOP says that farmers must maintain or improve natural resources, including soil, water, wetlands, woodlands, and wildlife. All farms have wildlife moving through, whether it's pollinators or coyotes, and so farms must maintain the conditions for those wildlife and or improve them. And so with this indicators, it's a great way for farmers to adjust their practices, and they should reflect on all of those pieces of natural resources: the soil, water, wetlands, woodlands, and wildlife. They're all important to the NOP regulations. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Joanne. All right, Libby, I'm going to hand it back to you for a couple quick announcements before we hop off.
Thanks, Jessica. And first and foremost, I do want to say thanks to both you and Dr. Furman. Oh, sorry, that's not Furman at all. I just said your university. Thanks so much to you and Dr. Quinn for the webinar today. We'd love to invite those of you that are still with us to consider joining us for one of our upcoming webinars. They're listed on the screen. I won't spend too much time on them, but I do want to briefly flag the second one, as I think that'll be relevant to a number of people. Later in October, Mark Lipson who is the former USDA Organic Policy Advisor and staff affiliate at the UC Santa Cruz Center for Agroecology, will be presenting a look at the landscape of technical assistance programs for organic growers. And the work is a part of the Grow Organic Investments supporting technical assistance for organic farmers in the U.S. And that is being held on October 29th at 2 p.m. Eastern. You can learn more about the key findings of their assessment and opportunities to improve organic technical assistance programs. As a reminder, I know I've seen this question a few times today. The slides will be sent out to all OTA members in attendance in the next week, and follow-up responses to the variety of questions as well. I will also include some of these citations in that follow-up communication for everyone. On behalf of the Organic Trade Association and the Organic Center, we really do appreciate your time and sticking with us past the 2 o'clock hour today. Thanks again to our presenters, and we hope to see you again at another webinar.